Hey, it's Nick History Channel. Today we're going to be doing a reading from Teach Yourself, The Middle East since 1945, and we're reading Part 9, Revolution and War. Our attention now moves east to Persian Gulf. Iran and Iraq has much impact on the late 20th century world as Israel and Palestine, but for very different reasons. Before Iran underwent a unique political and social and religious revolution, the impact which was felt right across the Middle East and beyond. Iraq came under the rule of a dictator as ruthless as any we will meet. These two states, representing a distinct form of tyranny, then clashed in one of the most senseless and costly wars of recent times. King of Kings. In Chapter 2, we saw about how the absolute but well-intentioned ruler of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, was trying to modernize his oil-rich state along western lines. Opposition principally came from traditional landed elite, often called the nobles, and the Shia Muslim hierarchy. Domestic support at first came from a tiny group of Western educated intellectuals and business people and the landless rural majority. International backing was always available from the West, eager for Iranian oil and to keep support of a friendly bloc against a possible Soviet expansion. In 1953, for example, U.S. support enabled the Shah to recover his authority after it had been briefly undermined by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Therefore, the Shah was very much America's man. The White Revolution. Shah Pahlavi carried out what was termed a White Revolution from above, like he was landed for him, obliging wealthy landowners to hand over their land to impoverished tenants. One estimate suggests that some 12 million Iranians benefited from the move, increasing the proportion of owner-occupied land from 26 to 78% over a 12-year period. Those who lost land were compensated, sometimes in shares. The profit-sharing principle was introduced into industry, and cooperative ventures were encouraged. Government grants and direct injection of capital came largely from the proceeds of the National Iranian Oil Company, a Western consortium led by British Petroleum. Mossadegh had briefly nationalized the oil industry, but the restored Shah reversed that decision. In an effort to diversify the economy, government help was given to vehicle and steel manufacture, mining, and construction. Dams were built, irrigation projects completed in a double quick time. Gross national product was rising at almost 8% a year by the mid-1970s. It had been estimated the average per capita income rose from $170 to $2,500 in just 18 years. The White Revolution was about more than economics. All sectors of education were expanded. University-level students encouraged to study abroad. Malaria was eliminated, and the benefits of modern medicine extended. Literacy and health clubs were established to benefit the many remote villages and smaller towns. A range of Western experts, from language teachers to civil engineers, flooded into Iran at the Shah's behest. Iranian women were urged to set aside their traditional subservient roles and play prominent parts in all aspects of life. Pictures of the Shah of his third life, Farah Diba, adorned every royal enterprise, from bazaar stall to ministry. This is not royalist propaganda, but an effort to portray women as a working partner. The conscious effort to make Iran a westward-looking country also brought all the perpetual glows of Euro-American life: the flashy cars, the nightclubs, the movies, rebellious teenagers, and so forth. White tyranny. A list of the achievements of the White Revolution looks impressive. Its cost, however, was unpleasantly high. First, there was the toll it took on the Shah himself. He became a living example of corrupting effective power. In 1967, in a ceremony of vast expense and magnificence, he had himself crowned Emperor of all Iran and the Kings of Kings. At the same time, Farah was crowned Shahbanano, or Empress. The move was justified as necessary to promote the royal family as a unifying force. Within Iran and abroad, it was mocked as a pompous tomfoolery. The 1971 celebration of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy drew equally skeptical responses. The elaborate and costly show was staged amid the spectacular ruins of Persepolis, once the capital of the ancient Persian Empire. The site was chosen to link the Pahlavi dynasty with the country's glorious past. In the light of what was to happen to him, the Shah might have been better advised to Persepolis to reflect upon the transitory nature of earthly power. Associating the ruling dynasty with the pre-Islamic past did not do much for his already acrimonious relationship with the country's Shia hierarchy, nor did any of the Shah's attempts at self-glorification, replacing the Islamic calendar with an imperial one that began the foundation of the Persian Empire some 2.5 millennia before. In carrying out all his policies, the increasingly autocratic Shah rode roughshod over the country's constitution. Ministers, in theory, represented the people, were merely his appointees. He talked of introducing democratic reforms, but took no practical steps to do so. SAVAK, the state intelligence and security organization, rooted out opposition and dealt with its perpetrators with summary ruthlessness. Distorted by the power he wielded, the once handsome Shah, akin to the cold and cavernous, was a lymphatic cancer that eventually killed him and began attacking his soul. The Iranian Revolution. Mounting opposition. There were two strands of opposition to the Shah. One compromised those who supported his westernized policy but believed it did not go far or fast enough. They sought more participation in the political process, for instance, less state interference in business and industry. The second group was the Islamists, opposed to westernization and calling for a return to Sharia. It is a measure of the Shah's political inaptitude that he managed to unite these seemingly irreconcilable parties. By the mid 1970s, the fairly apolitical bulk of the population, although they had benefited from the Shah's rule in many ways, found their confidence in him melting away. As elsewhere in the world, rising oil prices fueled inflation, the cut of the value of wages and savings. Against this background, the Shah's massive military spending program was criticized as tactically inappropriate. Most Iranians felt that too much oil wealth flowed into the pockets of rather few than the many. No one outside the royal inner circle had a good word for SAVAK. Informed of his people's unease in 1977, the Shah made the mistake of slightly relaxing his political control. One measure in particular, reducing the powers of the censor, served only to fuel the demands for more reform. Public protests at the end of the year resulted in several deaths at the hand of the security forces of SAVAK. The following January, popular unrest surged again. Students in Qom, protesting against a visit by U.S. President Jimmy Carter, were fired on by police. 70 were killed. The Shia branch of Islam has a particular respect for martyrdom. One of its traditions is that martyrs are commemorated 40 days after their death. So 40 days after the Qom slaughter, fresh protests broke out. This time the city of Tabriz saw more than 100 protesters slain. After another 40 days, similar number was shot at as Yazd. By midsummer, almost the entire country was consumed by protests. The Shah vacillated after trying concentrated tactics. In the early autumn, he ordered a crackdown. In Tehran, hundreds were shot dead. It was immediately dubbed Black Friday, September 8th, 1978. Martial law was introduced and thousands of arrests made. Public protests gave way to strikes. Within a short time, of the country's key industries ground to a halt. Ayatollah Khomeini, by this protest, had coalesced around the eternal figure of Ruhollah Khomeini. Few late 20th century figures were more controversial than this scholar-dictator. Born around the time of the century in the town of Khomein, from whence he took his name, he came from a long line of mullahs, or Shia religious leaders. A learned but humorless student of Islam in his 50s, he was proclaimed an Ayatollah, important religious leader, and 10 years later a grand Ayatollah. Khomeini used his position as one of the country's leading Shia clerics to speak out against the Shah's rule. For his opposition to the forced reduction of religious states, he was imprisoned and then sent into exile. As unsmiling Firebrand was now in his mid-60s, the Shah had thought he had seen the last of him. Not so. The older Khomeini grew, the more active he became. From Turkey to Iraq and eventually Paris, France, Ayatollah kept up a constant barrage of criticism of the Shah and his regime. By the late 1970s, illegally copied recordings of his unrelenting earnest speeches were in popular demand throughout Iran. Reason alone cannot explain Khomeini's popularity. Many of the things he advocated, women revailing, bans on alcohol and Western music, for example, had little obvious appeal to the students of both sexes who adored him. He was certainly helped by his absence from Iran. Without the intrusion of the awkward reality, his image became fascinatingly embellished in the popular imagination. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini developed into a long-lost savior who would one day return to rescue his people. Khomeini's nationalistic Shia roots contrasted favorably with the Shah's pro-Western secularism. In short, Khomeini was everything the Shah was not. The obverse of a popular hatred for the Shah was hysterical love for Khomeini. The two were a part of the same tidal wave of emotions that swept across the nation. What elevating and the revered mullah meant in practical terms, people only discovered when it was too late to do anything about it. By then, they had given the unyielding Puritan supreme authority for the rest of his life. In the fight of the Shah, stirred up by Khomeini's vision of Islamic Republic, Shia fundamentalists became the most prominent and outspoken of the Shah's opponents. At their head, the Mujahideen, dedicated fighters. As 1978 came to an end, appeals to Khomeini to return to his native land multiplied. Waiting until such a move would be unopposed as well as universally welcomed, he refused to come home as long as the Shah remained in the country. During the especially holy month of Muharram, beginning on December 2nd, anti-Shah protests reached a crescendo. The government strikes escalated and literally millions took to the street. Government buildings were occupied and ransacked and officials assassinated. To the Mujahideen, no task was too dangerous. If it led to death, there would be no greater honor than martyrdom. In such conditions, the government could not operate. Accepting the inevitable, on January 16, 1979, the Shah left the country. At the time, officials announced that he was going on holiday. This later changed. New Vision said he had left Iran to prevent further bloodshed. Neither explanation was particularly convincing. The Regency government that the Shah left behind was unable to cope. By now, the loyalty of the armed forces and the police was shifting from the Shah to Khomeini. The savior finally arrived on February 1st, 1979. Amid scenes of extraordinary mass hysteria, he made his way from the airport to Tehran to a crowd of several million. There seemed nothing he could not do. When the official government fled, he appointed a new one in its place. By the end, the Iranians had voted in a referendum to make their country an Islamic Republic on a new model devised by their religious and political leader. Under the Khomeini constitution, the secular and religious were merged. All government actions, from the passing of laws to the making of treaties with foreign powers, was subject to the scrutiny of the Grand Council, comprising the country's most learned Shia clerics. This reverend body was charged with ensuring that the government acted in accordance with the Quran. At the time, at the head of the council, the very pinnacle of the theoretic power pyramid, sat Ayatollah Khomeini. Against his judgments, there was no appeal. In practice, therefore, Iran had come swapping one dictator for another. The new Iran. Mercy was not Khomeini's best attribute of the Almighty. He gave his blessings to a band of young enthusiasts who patrolled the sleep looking for backsliders, possible royalist sympathizers, or just anyone showing an interest in so-called Western culture. Thousands of ex-royalists were reportedly executed. Women were beaten for not covering their faces. Shopkeepers for being found in possession of Elvis Presley tapes. Thousands of higher income Iranians fell about. Human rights were no more respected than they had been under the previous regime. One of the most destabilizing effects of the Iranian Revolution stemmed from Khomeini's determination to export it. Central to this process was often declared the fight with the corrupt West and its evil sympathizers. So a straightforward battle was not an option. Iran became a training ground for Muslim terrorists to embrace martyrdom. Thus, international terrorism entered a new and more violent phase. Meanwhile, an incident had occurred that turned nearly all democratic states against Iran's new government. When the Shah visited the U.S. seeking treatment for his cancer, Khomeini demanded his extradition. This was refused, and the U.S. had no extradition treaty with the new regime in Iran. In response, a gang of student extremists seized the U.S. embassy in Tehran and took captive 66 U.S. citizens working there. President Carter demanded their immediate release. Backed by the frenzied anti-Americanism in the streets, Khomeini refused. Carter applied economic pressure, freezing Iranian assets in the U.S. and placing embargo on the country's oil. Still, the hostages were not released. The growing desperate, the president authorized a clandestine rescue attempt by helicopter. Incompetence in a sandstorm caused the mission to be aborted before it could reach Tehran.